The proceeding will start shortly. 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 The proceeding will start shortly.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Treasury Select Committee evidence session on economic crime. And today we're going to be looking in particular at the role of law enforcement agencies. And I'm very pleased to be joined by three important witnesses, and I'm going to ask them in turn to very briefly introduce themselves to the committee, starting please with Graeme.
Good afternoon, my name is Graeme Biggar. I'm the Director General of the National Economic Crime Centre, which is based in the National Crime Agency, but seeks to coordinate the response to economic crime across law enforcement and regulators.
Graeme, thank you very much and welcome. And Angela, please.
Good afternoon, I'm Angela McLaren, City of London Police. I joined here just a few weeks ago as the Assistant Commissioner with responsibility for economic and cybercrime.
Great, thank you, Angela, and welcome. And finally to Pat, please.
Hi there, good afternoon. Assistant Chief Constable Pat Campbell from Police Scotland. Part of my portfolio is oversight of economic crime.
Great, thank you very much, Pat, and welcome. We're going to be asking questions one member after another, and for each question, typically the question will be directed at one or more of you as witnesses. But if you're not asked to come in on a particular question, would like to do so, just raise your hand and I'll do my best to bring you at that point. So starting questions, perhaps I could go to start with Graeme, but I will put this to each member of the panel. The most recent figures from the ONS crime survey for England and Wales show that fraud offences account for a third of all crimes in the survey, 6 times as common as theft of money from the person. Some people looking from the outside might say, why have the police authorities been unable to stem the flow of this epidemic in economic crime. What would your response be to that, Graeme?
Thank you. I think it's a really good question. We do have a serious problem with fraud in this country. It has been growing steadily. That's largely been mimicking the rise of the internet in the UK, and that has allowed more and more crime to take place. I think we see in the UK that we do not have the highest priority on fraud across law enforcement and policing. So as you said, about a third of the crime that is reported in the crime survey in England and Wales, it's an awful lot fewer of reports that actually get to the police. And I can explain a bit on why that, but 12% of what gets to police. But only about 1% or less of police resources, police personnel devoted to it. So there are fewer police than you would expect looking at this. To put the figures in context, though. So depending on which figures you look at from Crime Survey in England and Wales, 3.8 or 4.3 million offences. About 1 million of those, there was no loss from the fraud. So it was an attempted fraud that didn't lead anywhere. And about another 2 million of those, the victim was reimbursed, often by a bank straight away. So you're getting down then to figures that are a bit more like the ones that get reported into action fraud. They are still large. I don't want to in any way diminish it, but then you're down to the kind of 800,000 odd that get reported into the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau in one of several ways. And then of those, you have about 40% of those where the loss is £100 or less, and about 10% of those where the loss is £1,000 or more. So this is still a really important crime, and some of those that are over £1,000 get into really serious things that are life-altering for people. But there is a very broad range there, and so just starting at the 3.7 or the 4.3 million figure and a third of crime doesn't quite give you the full picture.
That's very interesting. And does that in part answer the question, why isn't there more resource of the police resource that there is being dedicated to this, because of the kind of logic around the numbers that you've just talked us through?
I think it explains why there isn't a third of police devoted to it. It's still 12% of, Angie will correct me if I've got that figure wrong, of crime that is reported to police. So that is still quite a lot. And a fair chunk of that is very serious. And I think we would all agree that we do need to do more. Not just for policing, I think across law enforcement in the round, so absolutely involving the National Crime Agency and others, and with the financial sector and many more. And we can happily come back to that in the rest of the evidence session. But I think we would all collectively like to see a little more focus on this across law enforcement.
Okay, Graeme, thank you. Angela, on that, is it also your view that there is insufficient resource of that available put into this area? And what sort of changes would you make if we were to get this right to better reflect the kind of prevalence of economic crime?
Yeah, thank you. I would then probably start by echoing the comments of Graeme. I think the other thing I would point out is that alongside the
is unable to take your call.
Sorry, we've got some interruption from it. Sounds like a telephone message. Is anybody? If you're on silent, it's not you, but if you're not on silent, it could be you. So just bear that in mind. But back to you, Angela. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I was just going to highlight that alongside the ONS survey, obviously we have reports coming into action fraud, as Graeme's mentioned, and they are increasing year on year as well. So it's not just the crime survey. In fact, our figures reflect that continual increase. And I think it's important to highlight that we welcome that reporting. I don't think it would be a surprise for members to hear me say that. We always welcome people reporting in where they can to allow us to see that full picture. In terms of, do we have enough resources to manage this across policing? Again, I think Graeme's covered it there. It's a very small number of police resources available to deal with what is a large problem. However, I think it's important to highlight some of the improvements that have been made and some of the further improvements that we hope to see coming forward over the next 12 months and beyond. I think the first thing, and I know we will cover these in more detail later, so I'll not go into them too much just now, is that we have now, since the last review of economic crime by the committee, we have now got the National Fraud Policing Strategy, which was agreed by the National Police Chiefs Council in October 2019. And I think that's important to highlight because that was bought into by all police forces and ROCUs across the UK. As a consequence of that, we are implementing new structures, both in terms of how we coordinate and the resources that are available. And in this year moving forward, we are looking to see an uplift in resources in both the regional crime units and indeed as part of the City of London's police uplift, which will be dedicated to looking at fraud as well. So there is a need for more resources. I think that's been highlighted previously, but I think there is a positive in that we are seeing not just an agreed strategy, but some resources being made available to tackle this problem.
Okay. Pat, can I just bring you in briefly, maybe with a Scottish sort of perspective on this? Are you sitting there with similar thoughts on these issues, including resourcing, as Graeme and Angela have set out?
Yes, very similar. The trends within Scotland are in line with the national picture. There's no doubt about that. Year on year, we've seen a 43% increase in fraud being reported to Police Scotland just now. Now, again, is our recording systems getting better, or is it public confidence has increased and that is pushing the figures up as well? But it is clear that there is a significant increase year on year, and it's a continuing trend we're seeing in line with UK law enforcement.
Okay, thank you, Pat. I'm going to come back to you, Graeme, but and leave it for Angela and Pat to come in if you want to on this one. So obviously over the last year, there's been a huge amount of money that the government's been putting out in terms of furlough support and bounce back loans as well. And we know from ONS work and Public Accounts Committee work and others that there appears to be a very high level of fraud around those, and no doubt other schemes too. Can you just give us some sense of how significant that is, and how you approach that, and what sort of challenges there are? It's obviously for HMRC and others to be heavily involved in that process, but can you just give us some sense of the challenge there?
Yeah, love to. So when COVID kicked off, we all kind of recognised this was going to be a big thing for us in the fraud community as well as everywhere. And we had fraud against the public sector as one of the things that we really needed to watch. I don't think we had quite realised straight away what a big deal it was going to be. So we were very much looking also at fraud against the individual and trying to track that, spot it, head it off, warn people about it. Again, Angie's got the very best figures on this through Action Fraud, but it ended up being less than 1% of frauds reported by individuals over the last year or so have been COVID-related frauds. So not as big as we had feared on that. There have been more frauds that have been kind of frauds in the time of COVID, that they have been facilitated by everyone working at home a little bit more, by the economic pressures that people feel under. And we've seen more investment fraud and romance fraud in particular, for example, and then online shopping, because more people have been shopping at home. But the biggest single trend is the one that you have highlighted. It's fraud against the public sector. Now, I would just say that the figures that you mentioned are not evidence of the actual fraud. Both the figures that the NAO have come up with, the estimates the Cabinet Office have used, HMRC's, BASE's, they've all been assessments of kind of assumptions about what fraud there might be based on past experience of similar types of schemes. But they are eye-watering, inevitably given the size of the amounts of money involved. I think it's over £40 billion that's gone out in bounce back loan schemes already to 1.4 million applicants, and about the same amount of money out on the furlough scheme. And the assessments there, the assumptions that people have been using have been in excess of 5% of that could be fraud for the furlough scheme for HMRC. So the Cabinet Office assessment on the bounce back loans would be in excess of 5%. When you look at the risk of not just fraud, but the money just not being paid back for other reasons, BASE's own estimate is between 35 and 60% of £40 billion. So this is clearly massively important to the Exchequer and the taxpayer and the public as a whole. So what we have been doing in it, we've been working really closely with central government, who have the main responsibility on this, just as you said. There is a counter fraud function in the Cabinet Office that seeks to coordinate all departments and how they try and police fraud against any money that they spend. Fortuitously, they actually published in February a guide on what might happen in the event of crises. They weren't thinking of pandemics in particular, but events such as this. So there was quite a good basis from them for them to build on. And they made sure that there were fraud assessments against each of the schemes before they went public. Now, government then, and this is not for me to speak to, you'll have ministers in front of you in due course, then had pretty hard decisions to make about the balance between reducing fraud risk and getting money out the door to people who really urgently needed it. And those decisions they made and seem pretty reasonable to me, but inevitably have resulted in significant fraud risk. So we see that coming. Sorry
to butt in there, but where you say, Graeme, you think that the judgments they made seem pretty reasonable to you in terms of the fraud risk. On what basis do you say that? What makes you feel that they got it about right rather than something terribly wrong?
I think so. Not as a law enforcement official, I guess, just as a member of the public. Those were very tricky judgments to make. There was, and it's easy to look back in retrospect, but at the time, the massive urgency to get the money out the door. So if I was sitting in those seats, I'd have made slightly, different decisions, I am sure. But then that's because of the job that I have at the moment. Okay. But what we have seen is the suspicious activity reports. I'm sure we'll come back to later in this session. We started seeing banks reporting in quite large numbers of SARS about potential fraud on these schemes. We highlighted that to government. Through our National Assessments Centre, so our intelligence analysis function, we produced an assessment of what we were seeing in terms of serious and organised crime threats to bounce back loans in particular. On the back of that, we wrote into government with our concerns. We provided a list of red flag indicators to banks, and we've been working ever since with government on other checks and processes that could be put in place to reduce the risk further. We have also been sharing data, and there's been a fair bit of data analysis across government on this already. We've been trying to wash some of the data on applicants. This is again particularly on bounce back loans against our systems to see whether there is evidence of a connection with someone who's previously been involved in organised criminality. And we've started a number of investigations as well. And so just to conclude on that, we made 3 arrests just on Friday that you may have seen reported in the media in relation to 3 individuals working in a financial institution in London who we believe have been responsible for a number of bounce back loan frauds. So we are on it, but and also I should mention Bayes contracted with Natis, which is a investigative function for local authorities largely, but they have given them more money to expand and take on this responsibility, and we are working with them. But we will only ever be able to look at the most serious cases, as indeed will policing. But I think we will find, as time goes by and we see what is returned and what isn't, there has been a substantial amount of fraud through these schemes.
Okay, so Graeme, thank you. I'm running rather short of time personally now, but did Angela or Pat, was there anything you wanted to add? No need to, and no, that's fine, great. Julie, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to look at the impact of the massive data leak from UK banks to US authorities known as the FinCEN papers. Perhaps I could start with Graeme again, please. The intelligence division of FinCEN designated the UK as a higher risk jurisdiction on a par with Cyprus. Do you think that's a fair assessment? What do you think of that assessment?
So just, I may have misheard you, but it wasn't a leak of UK banking data. It was very, very largely US banking data. It was. You're quite right. It exposed challenges that are global. I think what we saw in that was largely familiar from where I sit. I mean, familiar in a lot of the specific cases that came up. They were relatively historic. The data was the most recent was 2017, but it went back over 10 or 15 years. And the vast majority of those, certainly those with the UK nexus, were familiar to us or to the Financial Conduct Authority or the Serious Fraud Office. But also it was familiar in terms of the type of issues that it was exposing. And I mean, I wouldn't necessarily choose the words that that some Americans have chosen, but we know that we are one of the biggest financial centers in the world. We know that we have prided ourselves as a country on the ease of doing business here and the ease of setting up companies. And I think we also know that as a result of that, it can be too easy to set up companies here. And we have seen that repeatedly over the years. We have done some analysis recently on some of the laundromats that have come out of Russia and the former Soviet Union, and a disturbing proportion of the money that comes out of those laundromats, not much shy of 50% in one case, were laundered through UK corporate structures. Now, not through the UK or UK financial institutions. Some of the money will never have touched the UK, but corporate structures that have been set up through UK systems. So that makes really important the reform of Companies House that the government is embarked on. We've been lobbying on that for a long time. We put a very strong response into the consultation that the government did on Companies House, and its response to that was announced in September. And it's a really good response. It doesn't cover absolutely everything that we asked for, but it was at the higher end of our expectations and was widely welcomed. And what we would really like to see now is the legislation that will enable that being put to Parliament, and the funding that will enable the reform that will come with it being voted on. So it was pleasing to see in the spending review there was £20 million for the reform of Companies House as well. That's absolutely crucial. There are other things that matter in the way the UK works. We might come back to trust and company service providers, so company formation agents at some point. But reform of Companies House, I think, is the key thing that would address the concern that came out of the FinCEN files.
Thank you. Could I, if Angela or Pat have anything to add to what Graeme said in terms of the designation of us as a higher risk jurisdiction in the UK? Angela?
I think Graeme's covered certain elements of it. I think the other thing that we might want to touch on it, and I'm sure Graeme will bring it in, is the use of SARS, and I suppose how we proactively try to be in the best place possible across the industry. So I think Graeme, oh, sorry, the screen's just gone. I don't know if Graeme might want to touch on the use of SARS as well, but I think Graeme's covered the FinCEN files. I think I would just echo what he said and welcome the review of Companies House as well.
If I may,
go on. Sorry, carry on.
Just add a couple of points, as you have that moment of reflection when Angela comes in. I mean, and you will get this obviously very strongly from government ministers, but I feel it too. We did have the Financial Action Task Force midterm evaluation review of the UK, and it did put us top of the 80 countries it has reviewed so far. So it's worth bearing that in mind. We have real challenges still to meet. And the other observation, which I absolutely make to American colleagues when I speak to them, is they may consider us a jurisdiction of risk, but when we look at some of our data, they can be too. It is easier still to set up a company and for the beneficial ownership of that company not to be clear in the US than it is in the UK. So we have led the world on that. The Corporate Transparency Act that was passed at the turn of the year in the States will make a big step towards improving that. But on that particular area, the US has been behind us.
So the SARS regime being 30 years old, I think, at the moment, is it fit for purpose? Could you talk a little bit more about the regime in general?
Certainly. So, 20 years ago, we got 20,000 suspicious activity reports in, largely from banks. This year, we would not be surprised if we got 750,000. And the number of defence against money laundering SARS, where we are told in advance and asked for, or just given the option to refuse permission to proceed, is going to double, we think, this year. So the sheer kind of volume that is coming through is really significant, and very hard to deal with. Now, we all have more data in our lives, and you don't just recruit more people that relate to the extra amount of data you're getting in. So it's absolutely about the IT and the analytics we can put across that data. But what we are doing, and there was a SARS reform program that's overall run by the Home Office. So if you have the Security Minister to speak to you, he or she, depending on if James is back, can speak to that. But what we are doing under that is increasing the number of people in our financial intelligence unit. So in 2018 it was 80, it's now 140. The plan is to get close to 200. We are putting in place new IT to make it easier for reporters to get the information to us in the first place, and to give us much stronger analytical tools to use when we've got it. And then we are going to do two things on top of that. First, make it much easier for law enforcement to use the data. About 16% of SARS, on the basis of one sample we did, are used in law enforcement investigations. So there is not bad usage out of this. And the amount of money that's been restrained as a result of SARS has tripled in the last 3 years, 2.5 years. So from about 50 million to 171 million. So we're getting good use out of them, but we could see more use across law enforcement of the data and in the NCA. And then the final thing we are looking to do, and we've started already, is provide much better feedback to reporters on what we are seeing out of the data, so they can improve the reporting they give to us, but also so they can take account of the trends that we are seeing in the risk mitigation measures they put in place within their own organisations.
And are banks and financial institutions doing enough to combat economic crime, would you say?
So, I mean, they are doing an awful lot, and you've had a strong written piece of evidence in from UK Finance that sets that all out and explains that they estimate they're spending roughly £5 billion a year on compliance. Sometimes compliance can be ticking a box because they are required to do so and not necessarily reducing the financial crime risk. But if that's the requirement they're faced with, then they have to do it. They've introduced confirmation of payee over the last year. Again, something that my predecessors have argued strongly for, and we're waiting to see what effect that has. But it really should have a strong effect on one of the main types of fraud that we're seeing, the authorised push payment fraud. They've done quite a lot on fraud prevention, and I mean, I see that. I'm sure you all see that in the letters and emails that you get from banks. So there is a lot they have done. I think there are two areas where I would like to see a bit more, and many of the banks would too. We have been lobbying for the idea of, we need to get a new word for this, but configurable bank accounts. So giving customers more choice about how they run their bank account, so they can put more delay, for example, into payments. Prompt checks with third parties, someone they nominate on payments over a certain period. Just to swing the pendulum back from the trend there's been in financial services, absolutely driven by government and regulators for faster payments, but to give customers the option of slowing things down. So that's one thing that we would like to see pushed forward, and we're very pleased UK Finance and the banks have agreed to take that forward. The other, and this is only now becoming possible because of developments in data analytics, is to look at real-time transaction data. So banks are beginning to do that within their own bank. And as a result of the analytics they can put on it, spotting where a transaction is happening that looks suspect and stopping it there and then. Now, they've always been able to do that occasionally with human intervention, but they can begin to do it en masse. And that's only become possible over the last 2 or 3 years. What we're not yet able to do is look at the transactions across all the different banks as they are happening. If we were able to do that, and that is a very significant challenge, we would spot patterns much more quickly. And I think we would be able to freeze and restrain money, A, as it was defrauded from a victim, and B, as it was muled around different bank accounts to obfuscate where it had come from. So those are two things I would like to see banks do more of. But I couldn't finish the answer without saying it's not just banks. And a lot of the attention goes on banks on this. I mean, you'll see it in the UK Finance evidence as well. But there are a number of other sectors that are really important to reducing the threat of fraud in this country, be it insurance, be it retail, legal, accountancy, The tech sector and social media companies have a really important role too, and telecoms. So it really needs to be everyone coming together to make a real difference.
Thank you very much. And I'm out of time, but unless Angela or Pat wanted to add anything to any of that, then I'll move on. And thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Julie. And going to Angela, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Graeme, what percentage of frauds reported are cleared up and convictions secured?
So Angie might be in a better position to answer that. If you
Angela? One Angela to another.
Thank you. Sorry, please bear with me. I'm just getting some figures out. So we can provide figures into the committee in written format if that's helpful for your evidence gathering. It's quite complex, and I'm still considering myself relatively new here, so you'll forgive me if some of my explanations aren't as precise as some of my predecessors.
Sure, and feel free to send us that written evidence once you've given us your verbal answer. Thank
you. So if I look at trends over the past few years in terms of judicial outcomes, and I'm balancing this judicial outcomes against disseminations. So that is of the disseminations that we've made from action fraud to forces, we are seeing improvements in the number of positive judicial outcomes that are coming through. Now that is the number of positive outcomes. That is not the same as somebody being convicted in a court. So if I was explaining this in Scotland, that would be the number of charges that have been put forward. So that's how many reports are we making into... You've said it's gone up, but you've not told me what the figures are. Okay, so the figures are from, compared to 2016-17, there was an 11% percentage of positive outcomes. That has now risen to 19%. I don't have that in figures in front of me, I only have it in percentages, but we can provide that into... Oh, sorry, I apologise, I do, it's a few lines further up. So what we're seeing is that this year, last year, we've seen 6,377 outcomes from 33,000 disseminations, which is, in terms of a percentage, 19% is the figure that I've been given in front of me. Is that where we want it to be? No, it's not. And we would like to see further improvements in this space. We can, as I say, provide some written information to you. And what I would say is on the figures that we're seeing this year to date, which we don't have in front of me at the moment, we are seeing that figure rising again. So percentage-wise, we are seeing improvements. And as I say, we can put that in, but it's not as positive as I would like it to be. Right.
Angela, could I add on that?
Yeah.
Sorry, it's Graeme.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean that was the figures Angela was providing were as a percentage of disseminations, I think, which are when the data and the reports come into action fraud and they pull it together to see whether they can link it with other frauds, to see whether there are any leads that a police force could actually follow up, and if there are, then they pass it off to a police force. There are, of course, an awful lot that come in where there is just no information to follow up on. And that is very unfortunate for victims and frankly very uncomfortable for us. But it means that the percentage of results compared to actual reports that come into us will be a lot lower than the figure Angela mentioned. And
it's tiny, isn't it?
It'll be between 1% and 3%, depending on exactly which figure you take it from. Now,
I mean, there's not that much difference between 1% and 3% in terms of trying to persuade potential criminals that indulging in fraud might actually be a risk for them, is it?
No, it's not. We are working really hard at this to pull it up. I would just go back to the comments I've made near the start about.
Yes, I take account of those comments, but the overall size of fraud in the UK, one estimate was that it's between 0.5 to 5% of public bodies' resources defrauded. If that were the case, that's the same size of the defence budget every year, £40 billion, isn't it?
Yes, it
So
is.
that's £40 billion of potential public fraud, £40 billion of ill-gotten profits for criminals, and 1 to 3% of convictions from law enforcement. It sounds like a pretty risk-free occupation, defrauding public bodies these days, then, doesn't it?
So the figures that we started with weren't about public bodies. They were very largely individuals with some businesses, and very largely the public sector, coordinated by the Cabinet Office, responds to the 40 or 50 billion pounds that you were talking about there. So fraud against the public sector, be it in contracts or individuals defrauding through the benefit system or the tax system, and HMRC and DWP have got really strong capabilities to tackle that. The amount of money defrauded from the public reported to action fraud, and Andy will correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was 2.3 billion last year, but still an enormous figure. So I'm not in any way trying to diminish the point. If your point is that there isn't a sufficient deterrent for fraudsters or insufficient recourse for victims, then we would absolutely agree.
Right. So do you think there's a hostile environment against economic crime in the UK at the moment?
So I think there is a more hostile environment than in some countries, but not nearly hostile enough. So on fraud, Angela earlier on spoke about some of the things we are trying to do. If I go my quick pitch on it, I think there are 5 things that we need to do to make a material difference here. The first is around leadership and governance. We have not pulled this community together previously. That's one reason the National Economic Crime Centre was set up to do it. But we need really clear policy leadership in the Home Office, and then operational leadership from my team to pull everyone together. It's been a disparate community. Secondly, we need much stronger intelligence capability. We have traditionally looked at fraud on the basis of victim reports, and that's not sufficient. We need to combine it with bank data. We need to put our covert collection assets on it. We need to bring in the intelligence agencies to significantly improve our understanding, because fraud doesn't happen in the volume that it happens unless it is done in quite a sophisticated way by organised groups. So we need to get that understanding and then identify those groups. Third thing we need to do is then pursue those felons in a much more top-down targeted way. So instead of chasing every single victim report that we get in, which we would love to be able to do, but we will never have the resources to do, better to try and identify the groups that are creating the most harm and go after them.
I mean, this is crime 101, though. Why hasn't this happened before now, given the scale of the damage that's being done and the relatively risk-free environment in which fraud is being allowed to fester?
Well, it has ebbed and flowed over the years. We've been better at this in the past.
What, you mean ebbed and flowing between 1% and 3%?
Ebbed and flowed in terms of the quality of our response over decades past. But it is not good enough at the moment. I'm not defending that, but I am.
And the issue is surely that those who are very good at making their money in this way are often organised crime, and if you can defraud or create circumstances where you can get round the law in one instance, you can be involved in trafficking, in drug trafficking, in terrorism, and all sorts of other things. You're allowing crime structures to flourish by not tackling fraud, aren't you?
You are certainly allowing crime to flourish, and there is more polycriminality, as we call it. As it happens, we don't see that much interchange between
well, can we have some poly-convictions as well as polycriminality then, please?
Well, there were 6,000, as Angela mentioned last year. It's nowhere near enough, and we are trying to do a lot more with the intelligence capabilities that we are developing and the pursuit approach that I just talked about.
The Mail on Sunday recently reported that the NCA financial investigators have privately stated that they believe targeting corrupt businessmen with access to expensive QCs and claims of private wealth is a waste of time. Does that show the kind of determination to crack down on these highly dangerous people that we want to see in a modern democracy?
So it doesn't, I'm baffled by that comment. It has not been part of any conversation that I've had within the NCA. We've got really dedicated people working very hard, both investigators and lawyers, to do exactly what the Mail on Sunday was suggesting.
And how many convictions have they managed to?
Well, it's a mixture of It's a mixture of convictions and civil action as well. And the context of that particular article, I think, was around pursuing people through civil action. And we've been trying to use the new powers that we got in the Criminal Finances Act 2017, unexplained wealth orders and account freezing orders, to go after criminals in a different and better way. And we've been trailblazing with that with unexplained wealth orders. We've had 4 so far. We have lost one of those in the courts. Another one has gone all the way to the Supreme Court. So the point that was implicit in the article you were referring to, that criminals with a lot of money will fight you in the courts very hard, and that is very expensive, is true. And that does present challenges for us. But we've also had successes. We won in the Supreme Court recently on the very first unexplained wealth order. And then another, we managed to seize £10 million, or come to a settlement where we took £10 million off a suspected money launderer in Huddersfield and Leeds. So we've had really good success there. And account freezing orders, which we can use much more often than unexplained wealth orders, which will be used in fewer circumstances. We've done many more of, so that's now in the hundreds rather than just in the few for unexplained wealth orders. I'm not saying we haven't got a long way to go, but we are making progress. I
think we've got a very long way to go. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Angela. I'm going to come to Harriet in a sec, but could I just very quickly follow up on that, Graeme? Given the level of resource you've got, I'm trying to work out in my mind, given the very, very low cleanup rate there is here, whether this is an order of problem that more resource and being smarter is ever going to really get us to the point where criminality thinks it's not worth it, or whether this is just something that it's unrealistic for us to expect, given the sort of resources you're likely to have, to really ever get that number up to, say, I don't know, 20, 30%, where people start to think, no, it's not worth the chance.
So I think we can make a material difference to it. There will always be fraud, and there will always be criminals who are incentivized to do it. In the same way, there will be other crime. But the fourth leg of what I was going to suggest was around protect. It's designing out fraud, because you're absolutely right. We're not going to have the resources to pursue everyone, but we can make it harder to do this. And that's working with the banks and the social media companies and the telcos and everyone else to try and design out the opportunity for fraud. And then the fifth element is making sure we do put the right victim support in place and get the right reporting in from victims, which City of London Police have been working very hard at. But there will always be fraud, of course. I absolutely believe we can make a material dent into it if we carry on with this plan, get better data-driven intelligence and use it to go after the people at the top of the tree.
Okay, Graeme, thank you. And Harriet, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Chair. And we all wish the Security Minister a full recovery. Is he able to continue to engage with your work at the moment, or is there an acting Security Minister, Graeme?
So James Birkenshire has stepped back from being Security Minister at the moment, and Baroness. So
who is acting Security Minister?
Baroness Williams has taken on the portfolio.
Right. Okay.
From our point of view.
I thought I'd followed all of this quite closely in my time as a constituency MP, but also as a minister in FCDO. I had responsibility for the international side of things and economic secretary. Obviously very involved. And I have to confess that this is the first time I've heard of the National Economic Crime Centre that was stood up in 2019, Graeme. And are you part of the NCA? Are you trying to bring together all of these disparate parts? And are you overall responsible and accountable for the economic crime plan?
Yes, thank you. So it was set up in November 2018. I came in March 19. It's based in the National Crime Agency, so we get our legal powers and funding through the National Crime Agency, but it's set up and designed to be a multi-agency centre. So it's only 90 people. The actual core of the centre then has a broader responsibility I'll come back to, which is made up of about 60 or 70 people from the NCA itself, and then secondees that come in from the different partner organisations that are part of the community. So that is the City of London Police, absolutely, as we have on the line, the Serious Fraud Office, HMRC, the Financial Conduct Authority, Crime Prosecution Service, and the Home Office.
But you, at your agency, are responsible for the economic crime plan, is that correct?
So the economic crime plan is owned by the Home Office and the Treasury. for the government's economic crime plan.
It's just that, you know, a lot of the evidence that we got in this inquiry requires all of these different agencies, the NCA, the FCA, the Home Office, the City of London Police, to work together to deliver the outcomes that are set out in the National Economic Crime Plan. And, you know, it's not immediately apparent to me how setting up another organisation with another lot of acronyms is going to help the members of the public who are being defrauded by these economic tricksters. And so I just wondered, you don't feel your ownership in terms of within the Home Office of this economic crime plan?
So I said in the National Crime Agency rather than the Home Office. So the economic crime plan is the government's economic crime plan. In terms of ownership and responsibility for driving an operational response to economic crime, I absolutely feel that. Now, the government chose not to set up a single massive meta economic crime agency and merging all the different organisations that I listed, which is a perfectly reasonable choice, but instead to try and get them to cooperate more effectively. So I'm effectively the capping organisation, me and my team, to try and ensure that all the organisations work together effectively. And
it does suggest that there's more work to do to be that coordinating body for economic crime.
So, and that's the reason
someone like me hasn't heard of you yet. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the reason why we were set up. The feeling the Cabinet Office did a review in 2017 was that understanding of economic crime was not good enough, coordination was poor, and we weren't involving the private sector enough. So we were
still work to do. You would agree? Okay. In terms of other submissions we've had to the inquiry. A lot of people have drawn out the fact that data protection legislation, sharing information between all the different coordinating parts is a big issue. Do you also agree that those are real barriers?
So there are barriers there. They are sometimes more apparent than real, but we do think that there is a need for some new legal powers to make it easier to share information. But I wouldn't want to imply that we're not doing a fair bit of that already. That's one of the things we've been trying to drive forward. So we've created the National Data Exploitation capability within the NCA to look at serious organised crime in the round, but we've pulled in a number of different data sources and are quite able to do that under current legislation. So we've got the suspicious activity reporting data, all of action frauds data, company house data, land registry data, data from CIFAS, so a non-governmental body, but where a lot of industry fraud gets reported to. So we pulled all that together to analyse it and can make a difference with it.
And Angela, in terms of your work with action fraud in the City of London Police and where it crosses borders into EU countries, have you noticed any setback from the changes on the 31st of December on real-time police databases across the Schengen area? Have you noticed any change?
We haven't noticed any detriment at this time, and we get a lot of requests coming through from countries to take international inquiries forward. So I would say at this time we haven't seen that. Just on the wider point around about the use of data and information sharing, and I think Graeme's covered that we have a lot of data available. I think one of the key things moving forward to combat this growing area of crime is definitely going to be investment into data and our use of it. So I think it's good that we have the ability to get the data. I think what's going to be key moving forward is making sure we use that data effectively. And that's certainly something that Graeme and I are keen to work very closely on together, is making sure that we actually do use the data to get the results, to drive out the behaviours that we're seeing across the board. So I think that is key. I think there is a lot of data, but I think the key thing moving forward is going to be making sure we make investment into the systems to allow that data to be used effectively.
And also in terms of prevention. So, for example, we're going to be looking closely at the recent Gloucester report. It identified a number of failings at the FCA in terms of combating fraud. Is there more that you see that you could do and the FCA could do and the NECC could do to prevent fraud before it happens, and to really arm the general public as well in terms of what they can do to spot these things before they occur?
So I think there will always be more that we can do. And I know that's probably a generic answer that you would expect me to give, but I think the fact of the matter is...
And the FCA?
I think across the board, I think there's always going to be more that everybody can do. I wouldn't want to comment on any of the specific organisations. I don't feel I'm being here long enough to make that kind of judgment. But what I would
go on.
is that,
you must have had some frustrating moments so far with other agencies, no?
I think it's too early to be frustrated. But I think what I do have a frustration around, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to one of my earlier answers, and I hope you don't mind me doing so. When we look at the number of positive outcomes that we have, and I know Graeme's covered this already, and I know it's old terminology, but we won't arrest our way out of fraud. We won't arrest our way out of economic crime. So that prevention piece is going to be absolutely critical moving forward. So that's
why moving forward. It's been critical for so long. I mean, surely there must be some plans in place to improve prevention.
There are plans in place to improve prevention, and I think from my perspective, I think, you know, looking more closely at the economic crime and cybercrime portfolios within policing and looking at opportunities to be more efficient in these areas is definitely something that we need to consider as we move forward. I think there is a collective effort to get prevent messages out, and I think, as Graeme has covered already, you know, there are elements of design being built into the banking systems to prevent and to protect people, but there's always going to be more that we need to do in this space. And it's certainly a focus coming into this role. It's a focus that I definitely want to look at moving forward. So I think there is more to be done, and I think that's the continual evolvement of fraud and fraudsters, and we've seen it with COVID, means that we're always going to have to be putting more effort into prevent and prevention, because the narrative will continue to change.
And Graeme, what about you? Would you like to comment on the FCA and your working relationship with them?
Yeah, we work really closely with the FCA, and all really struck by the Gloucester review. And well, as we knew straight from the start with London Capital and Finance, and criminal investigation continues into that. There's a lot of work we're doing with them on investment fraud generally at the moment. So Scam Smart will be launching again this week, which is their periodic real big push to try and educate people about the risks of investment fraud in particular. We've been feeding into that to try and give some law enforcement examples and grit to it. The other thing I think which is new in terms of prevention, and you mentioned isn't prevention always part of it, absolutely, but the world changes, and as I mentioned at the start of this, the growth of the internet has been part of that. And what we have seen over recent years is for investment fraud in particular, the very pushy advertisements of investment fraud scams, kind of hosted on websites, popping up at the top of Google searches, pushed through social media. And so we're working hard, and this has been with City of London Police and with the FCA, but also the National Cyber Security Centre, to find ways of identifying those websites early, absolutely when the public report to them, but also on our own back, and then getting them taken down. So City of London Police and the National Cyber Security Centre launched the suspicious email reporting system in April. And that's for emails coming into your account, so a slightly different thing, but they've had 4 million responses from members of the public through that. And as a result, taken down 26,000 sites. We have been augmenting that more recently, specifically looking at investment fraud, which we started in November. And working with the FCA, National Cyber Security Centre, we've taken down 70 websites that have been selling effectively fraudulent scams.
17.
70.
70.
So a small number, 70 websites and 120 phone numbers. So relatively small, but each of those could have cost someone their life savings, or many people their life savings. New trends around that have been clone firms. So someone setting up a website pretending to be Aviva or someone like that, just one digit different. And also fake comparison websites. So you type in, you want to find the best IC you can, and you don't get one of the market leaders, you get a fake site.
So for my constituents who are bombarded with these things, where should I direct them to identify the legitimacy of these sites and phone numbers?
if they go to the FCA warning list, that will identify every firm that has been identified as operating in an unauthorized way, or where there has been warnings. That is the best way of identifying things we have spotted as looking like they are frauds. We would recommend Googling yourself the main providers and go to one of the market leader comparison sites. And if you're in any doubt, put a phishing email response into, I think it's phishing@gov.uk if you've been sent a phishing email, and they will look at it.
Sadly, I'm out of time, but I think there's probably quite a lot you could do to increase awareness of all those different routes. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harriet. Rushanara, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. I'm going to focus my questions mainly on the government's economic crime plan and progress on that. So can perhaps Graeme, if you could start off with giving an update on whether you think the government's on course to implement the plan, and what are the significant barriers, and then if others could come in with comments on that question as well, please.
Thank you. So I think we're broadly on course. We're just one player in this. As you'll have seen, there are 7 themes across the report, and there's transparency and supervision, international action, and things which are less core to law enforcement. But broadly, there has been pretty good progress. RUSI has been helping and challenging us by providing a quarterly update in public on what they assess to be our progress, and you can see there a good number of actions completed, quite a few that are ongoing, and critique from them. I think we've done a good job in improving our understanding of economic crime. One of the recommendations of this committee previously is that we should come up with better overall estimates of the scale, particularly of money laundering. That is really hard, so we are struggling with doing that. But beginning to get under the skin of where elements of it are coming from, we are doing. We have made some much better assessments now of the scale of money laundering, cash money laundering in this country, on the back of crime in this country, as opposed to money that comes from other countries. And I can go into that in some detail if you want. So our understanding has improved. Our collective action to respond, I think, has improved, with the NEC and all the organisations working with it. I think Companies House reform is, as I mentioned earlier on, one of the most significant things. If that can be driven through, that will fundamentally help us.
Andrew, do you want to come in? And then I've got some questions for Patrick.
Yeah, thank you. So I think one of the key elements of the plan was improving the police response. So I think I touched on a couple of elements of that earlier on, and I do think our police response to economic crime is improving. As I mentioned, we have now got a national strategy with implementation plans. We are seeing an increase in the volume of resources that are managing this threat. But I think the key thing that I would highlight is that within the City of London Police, we have made efforts to improve the action fraud service as well. And if that's the gateway for people to come into the service, it's important that that is right. So we had commissioned the Craig Mackey report, or the Corporation of City of London had commissioned the Craig Mackey report and gave us recommendations on how we could improve the action fraud centres and that general process, and indeed the victim care elements of it. So I do think we're making improvements across policing. I think there is a lot more that
so
can.
Am I right in thinking that the Action 26, the improving the police response to fraud, it's overdue, is our understanding, by a year? I mean, is that because of COVID pressures and other pressures? Do you think that? What are the reasons for the delay?
So I think there's a number of things that have prevented us from taking that forward as quickly or as effectively as we would want to. As I say, I do think there is an improvement happening. I haven't actually been through a meeting cycle yet of this, so I'll have more information as this progresses, and perhaps it's something that we could put some additional evidence forward on, if that would be helpful for the committee. I don't think we can blame COVID for not taking things forward. I think, if anything, policing has continued regardless of COVID. But I do think we are seeing improvements. I think, as I say, we've seen some improvements to the Action Fraud Service. We are seeing buy-in from.
That's really encouraging. I mean, I've been on this committee for some time, and I was on the committee for the previous inquiry. And what seemed to me to be a running theme, and it's not a criticism of the work that the police do, but the City of London Police doesn't seem to have the same sort of hasn't had the same traction that in the US, for instance. In the US they've managed to go after after those who are involved in economic crime and get them prosecuted, and there seems to be an issue. Do you think that's about what the police can do, or are there still systemic barriers to actually getting prosecutions, because we don't seem to succeed? And the FinCEN papers and the response from the US authorities highlighted some of those challenges. Where is the problem here? Because it does feel like, despite the good work you're all doing, we're not getting as far as we should be. And Angela mentioned the £40 billion gap, and it's much wider when we look more broadly at this issue.
So I think that this is an area, and I think Graeme touched on it earlier on, I think it is an area that has been under-resourced historically. So I think there is a need to put more resources into this area to allow us to put more reports forward. I think as a consequence of that, as I mentioned already, we are looking to put more resources into this space, but we are competing for resources against other priorities. And every force has a number of priorities that they have to manage constantly. We need more investigators, but we know there's a shortage of investigators across England and Wales. So we have looked to increase training and put additional training in the economic crime space. So I think we need to do a combination of things. I think some of that has been covered already, but a lot of it is about putting increased resources.
Just to pick up on this point about resources, the government's planning to introduce an economic crime levy to support the economic crime plan. How much is going to be generated from it, and what will you get? What will the police get, if anything, from that? Is that going to be sufficient?
I don't know.
Resource question.
Graeme might want to come in on that.
Briefly, and I want to get on to Scotland.
So very briefly, the government said it will look to raise £100 million from the levy, but that is levied. The intent is on the money laundering sector and to be spent on money laundering explicitly, not fraud. There'll be some crossover, but it is not a sustainable solution to how we fund fraud law enforcement activity in this country. And they've, as part of the consultation, they've asked for ideas on how that might happen.
And so Angela's talked about resource implications for law enforcement. How much is needed, and what are the ideas that you're proposing, just briefly?
So the 5-point plan that I was talking about earlier on is what we would propose. We had a bid prepared to go into the spending review when it was a multi-year spending review. That
how much were you asking for?
Well, it would be in the kind of low hundreds of millions across law enforcement.
Sorry, can you be specific? How much have you asked for? Because we can reiterate this point in this inquiry and reinforce that argument. I think we need tangibles, because otherwise we're gonna, this is the second inquiry that's been done on my watch from this committee. We need to move forward. How much have you asked for?
It was a dance of how much we thought we would get versus how much I think it was 80 million that we pitched for in the end, but I would have to check that and confirm. Of course, that is the kind of debate we tend to have more privately with the government, but per annum.
Yeah,
that was what we felt was a modest investment in making a material difference.
Yeah.
We could do a lot more with more money.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Patrick Campbell, can I turn to you? And I'd be grateful. Obviously, the plan is focused on England. Could you tell us how it works in Scotland and what sort of resources are applied in the Scottish context to deal with economic crime, and what we can learn from the Scottish experience and vice versa, and how much cooperation is going on in terms of joint working and learning and addressing some of these issues?
Yeah, no problem at all. Good afternoon. So the economic crime plan, we have our own in Scotland just now, which has been put together by ourselves, Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service and Scottish Government, and it broadly reflects the UK economic crime plan with the main themes and priorities around that. The model in Scotland regarding resources is probably twofold. Where I am just now, the Scottish Crime Campus is located within just outside Glasgow. We have 27 law enforcement agencies all located within the one location, all targeting serious and organised crime. And within this area, we have our Economic Crime and Financial Investigation Unit, which is about 150 officers who are targeting SOC-related high-level fraud. Our model is different from down south in England and Wales, where we basically are a national force here. And with the national force brings obvious advantages in that respect. We also are frontline responders, so 17,000 officers who are that frontline are trained up at the Scottish Police College in respect of fraud investigation. So we have that frontline response in respect of all investigations. Regarding our interaction with the rest of the UK, we link very, very closely with Graeme and the team. We sit on a number of his boards. And we sit in all the various NPCC forums, the National Police Chiefs Council forums in respect of that fraud targeting and environment.
Great, thank you. I think my time's up, but thank you very much for your responses.
Janara, thank you. Anthony, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I should declare an interest in that as Chief Executive of the British Bankers Association, I was responsible for the banking industry's battle against financial crime for 5 years and co-chaired the government's serious organised crime financial fraud task force. My questions are about the Sars regime, the Suspicious Activities Reports regime, which I recommended 5 years ago should be seriously reformed. I see that the Financial Action Task Force made a similar recommendation, the International Group of Governments, 2 years ago. I think everyone's agreed, the Law Society said the same. I think everyone agrees it needs reforming, but it hasn't been reformed very much. I think the question was really aimed for Graeme Biggar. Do you agree, you mentioned in earlier questions some of the problems in terms of the volume of SARS reports, 750,000 this year you're expecting. Do you agree that it needs reforming, and what reforms would you like to see?
Thank you. So there's two kind of chunks to the answer. We are embarked at the moment on a fairly major reform of SARS. To increase the number of people we've got on it, do better analysis on it, share more information with law enforcement, help them use it, and give better feedback to reporters. That's really crucial. That will really help. Part of it is a lot of the increase we had. So, for example, 80% of the increase in the Defence Against Money Laundering reports that you'll recall from Eurotime, which are the ones that drive the most work in the system, came from challenger banks and fintech. And it is them getting used to the system. It is them being under a slightly different legal framework. So there is work we can do with them that will reduce the number that come down and make the system more manageable. But if we do that, I think that will make an enormous difference to how effective the system is. The second chunk of answer to your question is a more fundamental reform to see whether the suspicious activity reporting system is suitable at all. I'm broadly in favour of what we've got at the moment. I think with better data analytics and better feedback to reporters, we can make this system work well. I think I would agree the financial sector, and I'm sure you will have done this in your time in those posts, has argued that we should focus a little bit more on the high harm SARS and not the kind of mass volume of very low level ones. So I think there's a bit more that could be done there, but I don't think that's a very radical reform. And then we can have a system that works really quite effectively.
Do you think the volume of the reports is a problem? Because 750,000 is obviously absolutely huge. And I know the concern from the industry was that they're required to flood you with so much information you couldn't really make use of it, and you wouldn't see the wood for the trees, as it were.
So, I mean, that's why we need really good data analytic capabilities. It's why I would be in favour of changing the thresholds, or at least the amount of risk that people can take around what they send in. There is also, it is the bank's choice about what they send in. I mean, there is considerable leeway within the legislation, and by and large, they take a fairly risk averse approach, are quite cautious, and so if in any doubt, they will send us material. In many cases, they don't actually have to.
you think, are you suggesting they should send you less material?
Yes. Of the ones where they are genuinely pondering and thinking, is this really necessary at the very low levels, then yes, they could.
I think that'll be a relief to a lot of banks. You mentioned in your first reply that you're getting information SARS from bringing more people into it. Are you talking about different sectors and different professional sectors like lawyers and estate agents and accountants?
Yeah. So for last year, we had 573,000 SARS last year, and 462,000 of them came from banks or building societies. So the vast majority, but you're quite right. Other sectors are under the money laundering regulations as well. So fintech and challenger banks, 59,000, money service businesses, 17,000, gambling, 5,000, accountants, 5,000, lawyers, 3,000, and then much smaller numbers of estate agents, high value dealers, trust and company service providers. So it's really important that we get the right type of SARS from those organizations. You would expect many fewer because, of course, banks are dealing with massive volume transactions, and so they will pump out inevitably lots of SARS. Lawyers are going to be much fewer, so they're not in any way, the figures should not be the same. But we're working hard with all of those sectors to try and get to what is the right number, and not just the sectors, but the supervisors as well. So OPBAS fairly recently set up within the FCA. So we're working with OPBAS to provide guidance out to the legal and accountancy sectors on what a good SAR would look like, when you should put one in, when you shouldn't. And we're also working with OPBAS, who are the supervisor of 22 of the sectors, and then HMRC, Gambling Commission, and FCA, who are the other main supervisors, on how we share SARS with them and how they can use the SARS to better assess the extent to which the sectors they are regulating are doing the right things under the money laundering regulations.
And do you think I remember attending a meeting with the then Home Secretary Theresa May, probably around 2015 or 16, with the heads of other sectors like lawyers and accountants and so on, and about the SARS reforming the SARS regime, and there was a real lack of clarity from the other sectors of what they were meant to be reporting and what burden there was on them on that. So
we're working really hard on that. Obviously, if you're one of the 5 or 6 main retail banks, then you can have massive teams of this. The legal sector is obviously thousands and thousands of companies, as is the accountancy sector. So it is clearly harder for us and them to make sure that all the right people know what they need to do. But we are in engagements, meetings, workshops 2 or 3 times a week with different parts of the sector. Not so much the banks, because we have routine engagements with them, but with legal and accountancy and auction houses and the like, to try and explain to them and educate them in the SARS regime and their responsibilities and what looks like a good SAR from us. So that's something we're really pushing hard on, is that engagement and feedback.
And do you think more could be done to make sure that to flag up to you, I suppose, that those SARs are intelligence led? Because as you said, with the banks, it's an industrial process. They'll submit thousands a day, and it'll be often for potentially quite small sort of infractions, and it's a quasi-automated process. But there'll be some SARs, I mean, both within banks, but within law firms and accountants, where it'll be quite intelligence led, and there'll be a very strong suspicion that something unusual is going on. Is there enough information for you to distinguish between those that are really significant and those that are more background noise?
So I think there is something that could be done to make that better. So you're absolutely right, we tend to get individual SARs. It's possible to put in a super SAR, as they call it, where you join up lots of activity, and we get those occasionally, and that is more powerful. What does not happen very much at the moment is the banks, to take that example, sharing information on something they are looking at, where they don't think they've yet met the legal threshold of suspicion, but they are concerned about something. And if they did that more often, they would be able to pull together much more substantial intelligence reports into us. So that's what we are working with them on now, both to do it within the current legal framework and to work out what further legal changes might be necessary to enable more of that to happen.
To make it easy for them to share information between the banks.
Yeah, well, to just provide more super SARs themselves where they've done the analysis, and we've had some really good examples of that from certain of the banks. And then secondly, absolutely also to share between banks, or indeed insurance firms. We've had some really good discussions with the insurance industry about how they can spot investment frauds happening across.
And what's the hurdle to that? Because again, this is something that's been discussed for many years, and it's a concern about obviously customer privacy, that banks haven't reached the threshold, as you say, of suspicion to give them the legal protection for sharing data between each other. What's the actual barrier to changing the law to reduce that threshold?
I think that's something the Home Office are looking at right now, but it's exactly as you just said. Banks are allowed to share information with each other if they have reached suspicion, as defined, but not before. And their legal teams are very careful about where the threshold is for that. And so we think there is a case, along with the banks, for changing the law to allow them to share information with each other below that threshold.
You would support that, would you?
We would.
Yeah. You mentioned the Defence Against Money Laundering Sars regime, that particular aspect of it. How effective is that, do you think?
So it's mixed in effectiveness. It is the primary means through which we have used SARS to deny assets from suspected criminals. So the figures I mentioned earlier on, 2 years ago, 50 million, last year 130, the year before last 130, last year 170. The vast majority of those come from Defence Against Money Laundering, SARS, and that's really important. And obviously it is, just for the audience, that's when we are informed about a transaction before it takes place, and the bank pause before enacting it to give us the chance to come in with concerns. It's not effective in that the numbers have gone up so enormously. I mean, we have 7 working days to come back with an answer, having consulted with any law enforcement organisation that might be relevant, which is not much time, and the volumes have gone up really significantly. So 62,000 last year. And we really need to address that, and that's the particular bit around fintech and challenger banks that I was referring to earlier on, because 80% of the increase has come just from those. So that's about it's about their KYC, their Know Your Customer processes, but it's also about how the law applies to them, which it does in a slightly different way to the main banks. And I know that's something Treasury and Home Office are looking at as well. It came up in the Financial Services Act, I think, before Christmas.
So I'm running out of time, but I just want to ask one last question. You mentioned fintech there and challenger banks. Do you think that this new sector is doing enough on financial crime, or do you, because it's often just portrayed that criminals will go to, that fraudsters will go to some of the less mainstream financial service providers because it'll be easier for them to operate without getting detected?
So I think it varies. So there's some really brilliant advantages the challenger banks bring, and the new systems they are implementing. There's some really impressive Know Your Customer KYC technologies that they are putting in place. At the same time, some of them seem to have business models, and this may not be fair, where they do the KYC after they have onboarded a customer. And then when they have done their checks and recognized that there may be more risk there than they were expecting, then they debank them. And that poses problems for us because it throws a whole lot of data at us that we would not need. So I think the position is mixed.
Okay, I would love to ask more questions, but I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm going to come to Alice in a sec. Can I just have one quick and with a very short answer, Graeme? On the SARS, 750,000 of them, you said that some of them you'd rather not receive. What proportion of that 750,000 do you think are not actually very valuable to you?
I'm not sure I can give you a reliable figure on that.
Best guess?
Between a tenth and a third.
Okay, so significant amount. Okay, thank you very much. Alison, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've got some questions around the role of professional bodies within this, and I think I'll come to Graeme first and bring in Angela and Patrick afterwards. Are the bodies in accountancy, legal, tax and other professions doing enough to prevent economic crime outside the SARS regime, which has already been spoken
of? So as Angela said earlier on, everyone can always do more. What the legal and accountancy sectors can do is less obvious than the banks. It's kind of less easy for them. And of course, it's a less homogenous sector. But we absolutely do see corrupt lawyers and accountants on the fringes of organised crime groups, and that is not to demean the whole sector. Of course, that would be ridiculous, but that does really put quite a important role on the regulators and supervisors of those sectors to try and make sure the right things are happening across the system. So we thought the establishment of OPBAS in the FCA was really important, so the Office of Professional Body Supervisors, and I think they're doing a really important job and made some great progress. So I think in their first annual report they observed that about 1 in 10 of the supervisors were ensuring that their supervision was driven by money laundering risks, and it's now the reverse. About 9 in 10 are. So their activity has definitely made a difference, but it is still a start on quite a long journey. So 40% of the supervisors have still not taken an enforcement action against lawyers or accountancies that they are responsible for. 40% of the supervisors are not working with us and OPBAS in information and intelligence sharing. So there's definitely more that can be done in that area.
Okay, thank you. Are there particular improvements that you would like to see within the OPBAS regime that they have at the moment?
So I think OPBAS need to carry on. They are doing a very good job. They will, I am sure, want to get firmer and more assertive with the supervisors that they are supervising, and through them to the firms underneath, having given due warning. But 40% of supervisors not having taken enforcement action doesn't feel right. So they need to push harder on that. I think there'll be a question for government, and it's probably not immediate, about whether a system that has 22 supervisors for the legal and accountancy sector can be right. We should give OPBAS a really good opportunity to show that this can work, but there'll be a question about whether it does. It's worth. I mean, those are the legal and accountancy sectors. The other key bits of the money laundering sector, supervised by FCA, HMRC, and the Gambling Commission. But there's a lot under HMRC's responsibilities. Their supervisory responsibilities that matters to money service businesses and trust and company service providers. And HMRC are working harder on that, but need to keep at it. They've made good progress on money service businesses. We've got more to do with them and with the Treasury on trust and company service providers. So the people you can go to set up a company in the UK.
Yes, I'm going to ask a wee bit more later on this afternoon about Companies House and setting things up, so we'll leave that until later. But a number of professional bodies have suggested to us that a root cause of economic crime lies with the participants in sectors such as the accountants, tax advisors, company information agents, which are not members of any professional body. They're outside of these regulatory regimes and therefore fall under HMRC in terms of them discharging their anti-money laundering role. You've hinted there that perhaps HMRC have more to do. How effective have HMRC been in this role?
Well, you commented on this on your last report. It hasn't previously been core to their business. They've definitely upped their game. I know they've been working hard on it, and we have been working with them. They've increased the fees that they charge, which has given them more budget to do this work. As I was implying a second ago, I think, and I'm sure they would agree with this, that they've made more progress on money service businesses than they have on trust and company service providers. Trust and company service providers can take many forms, but the ones who tend to be the more high risk are the ones that don't fit under another body and therefore are supervised by HMRC. And we see them crop up repeatedly in our investigations, including the laundromats that I mentioned very near the start of this evidence session. And yet the number of SARS that we've had in from trust and company service providers last year was 31. So all the other numbers we measure in thousands, but there were literally 31 SARS from trust and company service providers. You've got about 100 trust and company service providers who are creating hundreds of thousands of new companies each year, who are associated with a very small number of addresses in the country. And all of those things can have legitimate purposes, but it is a real challenge, and it's an area where, because of the risks, we need to focus more supervisory effort and criminal investigation effort, not the same and definitely not less.
Okay, thank you. And I should be clear that I've had concerns about Scottish Limited partnerships and the way in which they have been abused for those kinds of purposes and set up with limited transparency. I wonder if I could ask Angela what your experience has been in terms of the relationship with all those bodies in accountancy, legal, tax and other professions. Are they doing enough from your point of view?
So I think, you know, Graeme's given a bit of a response. The issue I have at the moment, and this sounds like I'm repeating myself from earlier on, is that I am still finding my feet very much down in this new area. So I think Graeme's covered it quite well from an England and Wales perspective. I don't know if perhaps Pat wants to come in. Obviously, I've just transferred down from Police Scotland, so Pat might want to give an opinion on how it's working up in Scotland in terms of multi-agency tasking. But I think, you know, from my experience in Scotland, I would say that I think the key to this is organisations working together. And I think it's important that we recognise that there are professional enablers, and by a professional enabler I mean lawyers, accountants, etc., who are working within organised crime groups, who are facilitating organised crime, of which money laundering is only one aspect. Now, that does not mean that everybody in those industries is corrupt, far from it. But we have to accept that there are people who are professionals who are working in this field, who are facilitating this type of activity. So again, I do apologise, and I'm very new in post, and I'm sure I will appear again in front of this committee at some point and be able to give you further information. But it's maybe something that Pat wants to touch on, because certainly with the crime campus, it's an area where we do quite a lot of activity.
Thank you. And I was going to ask Pat about that, about the kind of cooperation between Police Scotland and the Law Society, ICAS, Faculty of Advocates, and with OPBAS as well, and how that works from your perspective.
Yeah, no, it works really well, and just as Angela indicated there, just round about the Scottish Crime Campus, as soon as we start any of our operations, we have the ability to, within the one building, pull together 27 law enforcement partners from HMRC to the security industry and national crime agencies. So again, we have all the relevant individuals round the table to, at the commencement of any of the operations where there is that obvious crossover. And with that brings the multi-agency tasking and delivery model, which is also in place within Scotland, which we can thereafter task into some of the partners around that. You did highlight about the Law Society, and when you were your opening remarks, I was just thinking about the excellent relationship we have with the Law Society, where we have that confidential route in there. And we have came across that with some of our organised crime operations in respect of solicitors or accountants. And again, we have that route into these regulatory bodies.
Okay, that's really useful. And do you feel that you get the cooperation you require from HMRC in these when you're looking at people that are outside of those organisations?
Yeah, so HMRC have roughly about 60 or 70 staff within the crime campus, so a really large contingent within Scotland, within this one central unit. So an excellent relationship with HMRC, and as I say, we do bring them on at a very, very early stage in respect of some of the opportunities that they can explore for us.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Alison. I'm going to go to Felicity now, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My questions are on action fraud. So the majority of them will be to the City of London, to Angela. And I heard you say that you're new in the role, so I do appreciate that. Fraud is clearly a very, very big issue. So Craig Mackey in his report said 1 out of every 3 crimes now is fraud, but only 2% go detected. And the rate at which people are reporting fraud is also very low. I saw in the England Crime Survey that only 14% of fraud cases are reported to action fraud. Why do you think that is the case, Angela?
So having read through the report that you referenced, both the ONS and the Craig Mackey report, I think there's a few things I would bring out within that. And I'll come to your direct question in a minute, but I think if we look at the Craig Mackey report, yes, there were a number of recommendations. As I mentioned earlier, the report was commissioned by the City of London Corporation with a view to how could we improve the service that we're providing. And within the Mackey report, there were 3 key findings. that overall action fraud does have the potential to serve policing well in the UK. That was the overall, but within that there was a recognition that the operating system that we have at the moment is not fully functional, that resourcing levels need to keep pace with the increased reporting, and that fraud needs to be prioritised across forces in England and Wales. And I think we've touched on some of those elements this afternoon. So from that, my reading is we have the potential to have the right system, but the system needs to be invested in, and we need to make sure that, as well as taking the reports in, we manage them appropriately and the right investigation takes place when the report comes out the other end. In terms of your specific question around about the volumes that go into action fraud compared to underreporting, we know that that is partly due to confidence in action fraud and confidence in policing. So that has been stated in it, but there's other reasons that sit behind that as well. One of them is shame, and people don't want to come forward and report crime. And obviously, you know, regardless of whether it's fraud or any crime type, I would always encourage people to come forward and report to us, and we can help if people do so. And some of the other reasons that were provided were the fact that they felt that they were reporting it to their bank, so they didn't feel that they need to report it into action fraud. So there's a number of reasons for underreporting. Underreporting is a problem in all crime types, but obviously we're focusing on fraud today. So they're the kind of reasons that we're given. In terms of moving that forward, we've taken the Craig Mackey report very seriously. We have put, as I've alluded to already, we've put a number of improvements in place already, including improvements to the front end of the service, so what the public see when they report in, to try and make it more user-friendly for people. And the other area that we've put a lot of focus on is the resourcing within the crime centre. So within the action fraud centre, we've increased to 2 centres instead of 1. And we've also invested in our victim care to make sure that every person who reports into action fraud gets some form of victim support, regardless of whether that report results in a dissemination. So regardless of what happens to your report, when you report into action fraud, you will get an element of victim care. And that's really important, because we've touched on this before about prevention, but what's, you know, part of that victim care is about trying to avoid repeat victimisation, to make sure people don't become the victim of fraud again. And we are seeing some successes in that area. So I hope that answers your response.
Yes. And let me just ask you a simple holistic question. You mentioned the observations in the Mackey report about resourcing levels and having a better and more stable IT platform and prioritisation of local forces, and that you're working on this. How far along the road are you? If it's 100% to get everything working as well as it can never work perfectly. Where are you at the moment relative to where you were when that Times expose came out?
Okay, so I think we've made good progress in some areas, and we've got a lot of progress to make in others. And I'll expand on that. So if we look at the operating system, we still need a new operating system. We are in the process of our outline business case at the moment for bringing that new operating system in. So that's at the early stages. So in terms of that recommendation, there's still a lot to be done. We have put some tactical improvements in place, but that doesn't replace the whole system. In terms of the resourcing levels, we have increased the resourcing levels within action fraud. But of course, as I said earlier on, we have to manage what comes out of action fraud. So we are now seeing uplifts in the ROCUs, which will help moving forward. And in the final part of Sir Craig Mackey's report was around about increasing the prioritisation within forces across England and Wales. And that's very much work ongoing at the moment. So we are looking for fraud to be more of a priority across all forces. We're doing that in a number of ways. We are engaging with the forces themselves. The City of London Corporation is also engaging with the Police and Crime Commissioners, and indeed our chairman has become the deputy lead, I believe, for fraud in the APCC space. So again, just trying to increase awareness across the country. But I do think it's an area coming into this role new that I do want to put a lot of focus on in terms of raising awareness and engaging with our stakeholders. So you know, we could say we've got 15 recommendations, 8 of them are being implemented. There's a lot more to do, and I don't know if it's something that would be helpful for the committee if we could perhaps put some written evidence in around about the Craig Mackey report and where we see our current improvements and the work that we still have to do. But I would be happy to do that. And sorry, one final thing I should have highlighted. In response to the Craig Mackey report, the HMIC recommendations and other observations, we do have an implementation plan for the force, which again might be something that would be helpful for the committee to consider as part of our submission.
I'll defer to the chair on that.
Yeah, yes, please. If you could, Angela, write in on the basis you've just set out, I think that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Going back, Angela, to the Mackey report, he alluded to the fact that there was maybe a difference of opinion within the City of London Police as to what it needed within action fraud. Did it need more automation of procedures, or did it need more staff? Do you think that there's a consensus in terms of the resourcing and what is needed?
Yeah, I think we definitely moved on from there. I think the process of pulling together the outline business case for the next system has assisted with that, and it needs a combination of all of the above. So we do need more resources. We need to be able to have the right resources to manage the demand coming in, but there is an absolute need for improved technology, and I think Graeme's touched on it with the Sars situation as well. The volume of information that we're managing requires some form of automation. You know, that's the only way we're going to get through the volume of data that we're discussing here. A lot of the time at the moment, we are having to revert to manual processes, which are time consuming. So I think we need all of the above. I do think we have a better understanding, and certainly since the last committee took place, I think we have a much better understanding of what we require, but there is definitely more that we need to do, and I think that will hopefully progress over the next 12 months.
And let me ask you one final question. Do you think your communication processes with the public to give them that confidence in action fraud, do you think that they're sufficient?
I think they are improving. I think, having been on the outside looking in and now being on the inside looking out, I think we've been on a difficult journey in the City of London Police in terms of action fraud, and I think as a consequence of that, there is always going to be more we need to do in terms of raising awareness and raising understanding. We do see of the surveys that we carry out with people who have engaged with action fraud, we do see positive returns. So the people who do engage with action fraud are happy with the service that's provided. And the number of complaints that we actually receive about action fraud are very low, but I accept that's only surveying the people who have actually used the service and not perhaps those who have tried to use the service and maybe not taken that all the way through. So more to be done, but it's something we're acutely aware of.
Thank you. And let me ask Pat one final question. My understanding is that Police Scotland does not participate in action fraud. Is that right? And can you explain why?
Yeah, no problem at all. So yeah, we don't participate in action fraud. 2019, we were approached by action fraud to become part of the network. Now, there are probably two main reasons behind that. The first being that the funding stream for action fraud does not include Scotland. We are not a Home Office funded force, so we didn't get the benefit of that funding stream coming into Police Scotland. But secondly, the most important one is around about the victim experience or the customer experience. The model that we have in place just now around about the ability to triage, to basically deal with calls coming in from the public around fraud and thereafter look at the most appropriate response. We didn't believe that action fraud gave us any more enhanced model than what we have in place just now. What I would add was we still continue to work very, very closely with action fraud, and any Scottish-based victims that phone action fraud or contact action fraud are simply signposted to Police Scotland, and thereafter we will deal with the call as we would deal with any call coming in from a member of the public.
And from what you've heard about how action fraud is improving, would that lead you to change your view, or you're happy with how you do it yourself?
No, I think we're open to coming back around the table in respect to this. Just as I say, it was really around about the whole victim customer experience and about that immediate engagement that we have with the model we have in place just now. But again, we will continue to engage with the City of London around action fraud moving forward.
Thank you, Chair.
Felicity, thank you. Siobhan, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to look around some issues of corporate liability for economic crime, which is something that past Treasury Select Committees had some very strong things to say about. I'm not sure anybody from the panel who'd like to answer this. Could you please explain to the committee the problems faced in bringing prosecutions against corporations for economic crime?
I can have a crack at that.
Thank you.
Quite happy to let one of the others have a go if they want. But at the moment, we have to demonstrate the controlling mind, the directing mind behind a fraud, and for that to be the company as a whole. And that has always felt a fairly high threshold. And a recent case that the SFO took against Barclays, the judgment there emphasized again quite how high a threshold that is of being able to show that it is the board and the executives together that have taken a position. And with governance of organizations as complex as it is, and decisions kind of delegated and never being quite clear, that is a really high threshold, and a threshold that the SFO were not able to meet in that particular case. It's been an issue, obviously, that law enforcement, particularly the SFO, have pushed for some time. We saw with the 2010 Bribery Act, the implementation of a failure to prevent offence there in the same way there is for tax evasion. And that does feel like it has changed the way that boards and companies think about how they deal with and prevent bribery. And we can absolutely see value in that being extended in roughly the same way to cover fraud and or money laundering, but particularly fraud. Now, there's something not massively dissimilar to that with the senior managers regime that the FCA police in the financial sector. And if we were going to introduce, if the government was going to introduce a kind of corporate criminal liability failure to prevent offence for fraud, it would need to work out how the two docked, or whether one replaced the other. But it does seem an attractive option to me. In process terms, obviously this has been looked at quite a lot by government. There was a call for evidence by MOJ in 2017, I'm sure you've been well aware of. And it's now been put to the Law Commission to do some analysis and come up with some options on. And they started that work in November, I think, or certainly just before Christmas, with a view to reporting by the end of this year of 2021 with some options. So we're really looking forward to seeing how that develops, and a broadly open mind. But my starting premise from what I have seen is that there would be value in introducing a provision such as that, a kind of failure to prevent offence for fraud.
You've anticipated my second question, but I don't know if Pat or Angela have anything to say. That would creating corporate liability for economic crime be a helpful deterrent to offences such as money laundering? Anybody have any?
Yeah, thank you. I'll come in first. So I think I would just agree with what Graeme said. And yes, I think it would. I think anything that can, discourage behaviours in the first place is to be welcomed. And Graeme touched on the bribery and corruption elements with the Bribery Act prior to my time in City of London. But I know when that was brought in, we did see a real demand for training on bribery and corruption across City of London. So I think it's only to be welcomed. And I think, as Graeme highlighted already, we would just welcome the outcome of the Law Commission review.
Okay. Does sufficient guidance exist to explain the responsibility of company boards in preventing fraud and money laundering? Don't know whether that would be to you, Angela, to you, Graeme.
That's a very good question that I'm not sure I got the most informed answer to. On money laundering, I think there will be the FCA provide a lot of guidance, and that would be something they consider their core responsibility. And I think that would come in both through the money laundering regulations and the senior managers regime. I think it is a really fair challenge on fraud. Of course, there isn't the same legal imperative for them to do it, and it is treated a bit differently. Fraud is a cost of doing business, be it in the public sector or the private sector, a cost that is too large at the moment, but it is treated as a cost of doing business, whereas on money laundering, there is a compliance issue where the FCA will hold you to account for not doing it and potentially fine you significantly. But I think I would like to take that away, actually, about whether there is enough guidance on fraud and responsibilities of boards.
Thank you. The law, as we talked about, the Law Commission looking at this area of law. Do you hope to be able to work with them on it?
Yeah, absolutely. We will feed into them with our views. I think.
What do you hope will come out of it?
So, I'm trying to remain open. My starting premise, as I said, was I find the idea of an offence such as that attractive. And I've seen the challenges the SFO have had, so I am attracted to it. There are different views about it. The senior managers regime in the financial sector is relatively recent, and there will be an argument that we should let that play out and see if it has a sufficient effect. I think one thing that's worth recognising in all of this is we can default to talking about the financial sector an awful lot, and in fact the banks an awful lot in this. Other sectors matter just as much. Telecoms, insurance, the tech sector and social media companies. And I think it's probably in some of those sectors where we would see a bigger change in behaviour as a result of such an offence.
Thank you. And to you, Pat, has this been a problem in Scottish law as well?
No, not that we're fully aware of or exposed to as such. I mean, we have the common law powers up within Scotland to refer back to, but we've not really had that same experience that Graeme's highlighting just now.
Okay, thank you. And those are my questions.
Great, thanks, Siobhan. Could I go to Steve now, please?
Thank you, Chair. And since I'm going to ask about technology, I just refer to my declared interest in GlintPay. Before I get on to technology, can I just take Mr. Biggar back to something he said earlier? You'd put in a bid for £80 million a year, I think you said. And we've previously talked about the dent this is, the small dent this is making in fraud. Now, in the past, I've advocated better, higher levels of resourcing for fighting fraud. How much money would you actually need to make a serious dent in fraud in the United Kingdom?
It's going to sound very woolly, I'm afraid, but it's entirely scalable. I mean, we are making inroads at the moment with the investment, and I haven't mentioned it before, but I should do. The government has already made into this into illicit finance. When the NEC was set up, it wasn't just the NEC; it was a series of other capabilities, and that was about £48 million a year. And the government has committed to putting an extra £63 million in the last spending review. So we've got a lot of things in train that will make things better. The 80 million, and I will be kicking myself if I've got that figure wrong, would have paid for more investigative capability in the NCA and City, more intelligence capability here, and then stronger regional teams. So our collective pitch with policing was we're never going to be able to afford, and it probably isn't effective, to build up really strong fraud teams in 43 local forces. But we could have a go at doing that around the ROCUs, the regional organised crime units, and so it was to build up teams there. The amount of money I was talking about would have put teams into there, but they would still be relatively small. We could take on obviously more with more money, but that is absolutely not answering your question. Apologies for that. I'm not sure I have a figure.
Okay, well that in itself is a very interesting answer, because I for one would like a major dent made into fraud in this country. I've had constituents with dreadful dreadful, been victims of terrible frauds, lost a lot of money, life savings. So I, for one, would like to know, I don't think we should ask you to write to us with it today, but I, for one, would very much like to know how much resource we really need to put into policing in order to seriously deter criminals through the knowledge that they're highly likely to be caught. So, and also not only how much resource you need, but how quickly you can scale up to it. So perhaps I could just leave that thought with all three of you. I think it's one of the fundamental duties of the state to deal with it. Could I just then turn on to social media and technology, because it does seem that social media and the search engines in particular, there's only really one huge one, do make a lot of revenue from hosting advertisements, which might well be for fraudulent schemes. So perhaps I might ask Mr. Campbell, do you think that Google and other platforms ought to be doing more to deter fraudulent advertisements?
I think you can always do more. There's absolutely no doubt about this. Angie's touched on that recently. I think within Scotland, within Police Scotland, we've realised that there is a significant gap with our capability and our capacity in respect of cyber-enabled or cyber-dependent fraud or economic crime. We've recently launched the National Cyber Strategy and our implementation plan around that. But that is going to cause us, that is going to require a significant financial injection, both in line with technology and also with resources. So we estimate in the region of 260 resources over the next 3 years, specifically sitting within that cyber arena to get us fit for purpose. But in the answer to your question, there's no doubt these multinational organisations can certainly do more.
So, Ms. McLaren, do you think that there's more that they could be doing, and how do you find them to work with?
So I think that, as Pat said, there's always going to be more that can be done. I think there's a couple of areas I would probably touch on. If we look at the types of fraud that are most emergent at the moment, the vast majority of them will rely on some form of social media platform. So whether that's romance fraud, whether that's investment fraud, online shopping. So absolutely the consistent theme through all of these frauds is obviously the use of social networking and social media sites. So yes, there is much more that can be done. I know it's been a feature of previous discussions at committees just around about the scale of social media within the frauds that are taking place. We've got some statistics here which may or may not be useful. In 1920, social media featured in more than 39,000 crime reports to action fraud, with losses of over 120 million. So the scale is significant, and I think there's no two ways about that. One of the areas, and Graeme's touched on the taking down sites, and you know how many sites can we take down, and we do take down many sites in various different areas, but one area that would be worth touching on would be the online harms bill. So we did put our response in around about the online harm bill, and we did seek that fraud would be included in that, because this is not something, you know, we can take down sites all day long, but for every site we take down, more and more sites will be replaced. So I think it's important that we start to design in some activity that will help us taking forward the online fight. I know Graeme will have comments as well, but that is your social media sites, your telecommunication sites. There is absolutely more that can be done in that technology space. And as I say, for every site we take down, more sites will come in. And if we go back to the victim within all this, they're absolutely preying on people's vulnerabilities, whether that's loneliness, whether that's concerns about their financial security in the future. So these are not just sites that cause no harm. These are absolutely focused on really vulnerable people, or people who are vulnerable at a point in time. So yes, in answer to your question, more that can be done, and we think that the online harms bill would be an appropriate way to take that forward.
Well, that's very good. And have ministers given you any indication of how they're likely to react to your submission in relation to the bill?
I don't think we've had an official response yet, to my knowledge, but that's something that we will be looking for.
I can clarify on that point. So it is not included in the the current bill.
It's not in the bill, no. I was wondering whether you'd received any indication about how seriously they were taking
our requests were prior to the bill being published, as it was being being developed.
Oh, I see. So it's perhaps something that we'll come back to. Well, perhaps some of us might take a view on that a bit later. So we're in a position then, as I understand it, where the FCA are paying Google to highlight warnings to consumers, but Google and others presumably are, I don't wish to single out Google, are making a lot of revenue from advertisements. Do you think more should be done to hold these platforms to account for what they publish?
Yeah, if I can pick up on that one, yes, absolutely. So that there's three bits of the tech industry that matter here. I think there is web domain hosting, there is then the search, as you've been talking about, and social media companies, as well as Angela spoke about. So they are hosted somewhere, then Google, typically, Bing, other providers are available, provides the results. But also lots of scams are spread on Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp as well. So those are the three categories. You're absolutely right. Google and other search providers charge the FCA to put up warnings against advertisements that they are being paid to put up as well from fraudsters. And that must change. So that there is not a sense of know your customer in the tech industry around the search engines or web host providers in the same way there is in banks. It'll never be quite to that extent, but it has to change. They should know who they're dealing with. They should remove fraudulent sites. They should report to law enforcement on the fraudulent sites. They should support us and the FCA in our efforts to go after them. So actually provide information on who is paying for these sites, because they don't know their customer. Actually, that's often a dead end. If they did, they could do that. And they need to do more to communicate to members of the public about the risks involved.
Okay, well, very good. Well, we're really running out of time. I wanted to ask you a bit more about the role of technology in solving some of these problems, but I think that's probably too big a subject, and I shall therefore draw stumps there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve. And finally, going back to Alison, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I've got some questions around Companies House, as I hinted at earlier. Could I ask, Graeme, first of all, do you consider £12 to incorporate a company too low a level? And is this a hindrance in the fight against economic crime?
It's very low, and you can actually do it for less. So some of the company formation agents, as a kind of lost leader tactic, will charge you less to set up a company. It feels a very small amount of money. It is also done incredibly quickly. The vast majority of incorporations turned around within 24 hours. Now, the government is committed to still making it easy, and I have no objection to that. But we do need to weed out the crime and the criminals from this. And the proposals they have come up with in the consultation response are strong. You know, verification of the identities of the directors and the people of significant control, greater powers to the registrar to check, making sure that any agents who are doing it for others are supervised in themselves. That needs to be really strong, and a harder line on dormant accounts. They're all really important proposals.
Okay. Do the verification proposals go as far as saying, as if you were getting a passport through the government verify scheme, or is it a different mechanism from your understanding?
So I think that's still being developed. I haven't seen a sense it's going to be as strong as that. There will be a single user ID that people will have. Many people are directors of multiple companies. That will help in being able to spot people setting up multiple companies, which is of course fine, but then using them to phoenix illegitimate companies. So that could really help. There are a number of things that we asked for that aren't in the proposals. I'm still worried about the extent to which thousands of companies can be registered at the same address, and we can't get behind that to find out where they are from. And there will be limited change around that. There is work around trying to unpick circular ownership structures within the Companies House reform, and that will really help. But I think the main thing, the various things we would like a bit more of, is just to see progress made on the proposals that have been set forward. So the money to make it happen and the legislation to enable it.
Okay. You mentioned earlier about the £20 million that was announced in the spending review. Is that sufficient, do you feel, to do all of these things, to crack down on the people that need to be cracked down on and to allow the system to function effectively?
I think you'd have to ask Companies House on that. I'm not close enough to provide an informed answer. It is good though. I mean, I'm very pleased with that. I'm also very pleased with the cooperation that we've had from Companies House. It's just really important in all of this. They have been unempowered, legally not able to do things, and under-resourced. With what they've got, they've done a great job. We've done some really good work with them over the last year on looking at fraud. They've helped us with looking at frauds against bounce back loans, for example. They've helped us at looking at potential fraudulent contractors into providing the NHS with equipment during COVID. And we're having more interaction with them between both the NCA and law enforcement in general, which has been helpful.
It had been suggested prior to the announcements on Companies House reform that the way in which companies were registered actually gave some assistance to law enforcement agencies in trying to track people down. Is there any veracity to that claim?
I haven't heard that, and I'm not quite sure what it's getting at. I mean, what we do know is that companies are fundamental to a lot of organised crime, and if we can get to the beneficial owner of that, and obviously legislation over the last few years has made that better, then we can make much quicker progress. And you mentioned SLPs earlier on. The introduction of beneficial ownership kind of lagged with SLPs, but when in 2017 it was introduced for SLPs, you saw the number of new SLPs being set up the following year drop by 85% or something. So it just shows how attractive it is to criminals to be able to set up a company and obfuscate their identities. So the more we can do to get around that, the better.
It's true that SLP registrations did fall down after that was brought in, but there was some suggestion that perhaps people were just registering companies through different vehicles, using perhaps trusts or through Northern Irish limited partnerships instead. Is there an issue that if you squash down on one part, it just rises up somewhere else?
So it does. They will obviously go where they can find a way of obfuscating either who they are or what they are doing. But we are getting there. There's obviously been the progress that parliamentarians have pushed on beneficial ownership in overseas dependencies, crown dependencies and overseas territories. The US move, as I mentioned earlier on, with the Corporate Transparency Act will help. That was another big area where it can happen. I think one area within companies reform that we'll need to look really closely at is the ability for company formation agents based overseas to set up companies with corporate directors where you can't get past that to the ultimate ownership. But that's something they're still looking at, and there's a consultation out at the moment on that, but that's one that we'll be pushing in quite strongly on.
Okay. One of the sort of limitations of Companies House at the moment is that they will take information, but they don't do any enforcement action with that information. And Scottish Limited Partnerships, taking them as an example again, people who hadn't registered a person of significant control, there was no follow-up on that, and there was no enforcement of that, and there was no fines handed out for people who failed to comply. Will that be brought in within the new scheme that's being proposed?
So the Companies House is not one of the core NEC partners, so I'm stretching slightly at the limit of my knowledge, but my understanding is they have taken a number of enforcements, so over 200, to prosecute people who have not provided the beneficial ownership and got a goodly number of convictions. I would expect that with the reform that is being planned, which is both more people and better analytical capabilities and more powers, that they will do more of that in the future.
Okay. My understanding is that it may well have changed in the figure since last time, but the person that was prosecuted was somebody who was trying to set it up to expose the system rather than actually somebody who was doing it for other means. At the moment, as you mentioned, there's no cap on the number of directorships that individuals can hold at any one time. And a recent report highlighted there were nearly 2,000 individuals holding offices in more than 50 companies in 2017. Do you think that it would be useful to have a cap on the number of directorships that an individual can hold?
So we had suggested that, and a number of people did into the consultation. I think the response that has come back is not to do that, but that being able to see which with the better digital identification and the single user accounts, you will, that a individual has multiple directorships will be a really good intelligence prompt to look into it. So there were, a number of the recommendations we made that weren't accepted, but you can see that there is still progress and sense in what is being suggested. So I'm happy with that. I'm not going to push that one further.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that's probably the kind of the limit of questions that I had there. I don't know if Patrick or Angela wants to come in on any of these issues around enforcement or around how you track people down who have perhaps been up to no good. Don't have anything.
No, I think Graeme's covered everything. Thanks.
The only final point I'd make on that is it's partly about companies house reform. It's also got to be the company formation agents. So you've got to fix both at the same time. Yeah.
Have you any further ideas about how you might go after company formation agents? Because you mentioned the only 31 SARS coming from out of the more than 100 providers, and that's really quite a shocking figure to me. Is there more that could be done to deal with that?
Yeah, so we did an intelligence assessment on that earlier last year. It will be now just under a year ago. Into trusting company service providers, we are developing a plan with HMRC and HMT and the Treasury to have both more supervision and more enforcement against company formation agents. So we're on it, but it is not the most developed of our plans. We've really got to do more work on that.
Okay. And I suppose the very last question that I had was around the registration of overseas entities bills and the proposals around that, about property ownership. And is there an issue around trusts and property ownership that we also need to be looking at in terms of money being moved around?
Yes, and that applies both to Robo, which will show the beneficial owner of property in the UK, but also to the progress that is being made in the Crown dependencies and overseas territories to open up beneficial ownership of their registers, which are only on companies and not on trusts. So it goes to your point earlier on about, will criminals just go somewhere else? Trusts is the kind of next area, and that's where we would like to open up more beneficial ownership information too.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you very much.
Great, Alison, thank you very much. That brings us to the conclusion of this session. So can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for joining us. I think this has been a very useful initial discussion on our inquiry. It has shown or set out the sheer scale of the challenge that there is here, the growth in economic crime, particularly in the new environment of the COVID pandemic. And that it's proving to be one of those areas that's difficult to get on top of. And we've covered clearly a number of strands in terms of looking at this issue, in terms of resourcing, the importance of company house reform, the importance of prevention, as well as tracking these criminals down. SARS, clear up rates. We had a very important discussion about that, I think, on BAS and online, the online harms bill and social media and so on. So I think we've covered a lot of ground, and we thank you very much indeed for giving us a good start to our inquiry in terms of setting the scene and the principal issues. So thank you very much indeed for appearing before us. That concludes this session. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has